For the following hip flexor release tutorial, what we're going to be going over is a long hip flexor release. This is actually a part of the quadricep muscle group, and it's referred to as the rectus femoris. This is a muscle that starts at the front of the iliac crest or your hip bone, travels all the way down the front of the thigh to insert into your patella. Now, when this thing is locked up, it makes accessing the glutes during sport or during exercise very difficult. But in order to fully understand how to drive a cogent release into these things, one has to understand that when these tend to become a motion restriction, what it will put the individual in is what's called an anterior pelvic tilt, or think like Instagram girl butt position. So in order to actually drive a stretch in this, you have to do the equal and opposite, which is you want to think tuck your tailbone underneath you while simultaneously being able to flex the glute of the affected hip. So if we wanted to start with an introductory version of these, what you want to do is to take a knee, preferably on a soft surface like this, and you want to start in a stacked position. What I mean by that is that the bottom of the rib cage is stacked directly over the center of the pelvis. You do not want to try to start this stretch in a fully lunged or extended position in the lower back. And also too, it helps to have something to hang on to, whether that's a squat rack or any sort of like plyo box, something to hang on to for balance. So the first step in this is to start as tall as you can. You want to imagine that someone's got a string tied to the top of your head and they're going to yank straight up on that thing. You should start to feel a stretch load get driven into the front of the hip capsule. So after starting tall, you want to think tuck the tailbone underneath you, contract the glute while you drive the front of the hip capsule straight forward in almost a lunge style. So now if you find yourself drifting further position, like say you elevate your rib cage or create a little bit of extension in your lower back, you find yourself drifting and not getting much of a stretch effect, go back to baseline, focus on starting in the stacked and tall position, tucking the tailbone, contract the glute and maintain that contraction as you drive the hip capsule forward to your barrier. And you want to explore the ugly corners and end ranges of this with a contracted glute. Maintain about a 4 to 5 second hold before backing off, feeding some slack into the system, giving your hips and lower back a break. But also too, is you can play around with rotation angles on this, which we'll get into momentarily. Now for most people, this will be a decent stretch load in the front of the thigh. However, if we want something that's a little bit more heavy-handed, all we have to do is elevate that rear foot behind us. So whether you've got a bench or an ottoman or a couch, in that this is called the couch stretch, elevating the rear foot behind you will preload the rectus femoris and you'll get a more stretch from origin to insertion in the muscle. So now by starting in this position, you may have to play around with where your knee is relative to your hips in space. Most people are not going to be able to do this, like say against the wall with a flat upper portion of their foot. Start easy before exploring the end ranges. But again, we go as tall as we can first, tuck the tailbone underneath, contract the affected glute on the same side while driving that hip capsule forward to your end range, and really try to push that end range as far as you can while maintaining that contracted glute. But as I mentioned earlier, we can play around with rotation angles at the hip. So if we wanted to drive, say, internal rotation or external rotation with this extension and combine two at once, for the internal rotation variation, all you'd have to do is kick your heel out away from midline. But now notice that this should try to point your pelvis in the opposite direction. So you're going to have to square up the hip, which you should feel a bit of a torque load in the front of the hip. And again, same steps. We start tall, tuck the tail, contract the glute, maintain that contraction as we drive into the stretch barrier. Or we can go with an external rotation variety where we bring the heel in toward midline, square the hips relative to our stretch vector, go tall, tuck tailbone, contracted glute, all the way to the end of the line.